Hello and welcome to our 7th session on the Scottish Wars of Independence. Today we are going to be looking at applying what we've learned, specifically on the Treaty of Birgham, to and evaluate the usefulness type source question. So today's session we're going to learn how to apply what we know to evaluate the usefulness of a source. By the end of the session you should be able to evaluate the usefulness of a source correctly, meeting the requirements set out by the Higher History course, and be able to apply what you've learned about the Treaty of Birgham to use it to answer a source evaluation question. As a wee guide for today's session, if you have a printer handy, it would be great to print out today's PowerPoint slides and using highlighters if you also have those. Highlight the different relevant sections as we go through. It's going to help to build up a guide for yourself to use as a specimen template on how to do the evaluate the usefulness question. So our question today is going to be based on what we just learned in the last session about the Treaty of Birgham. As I mentioned in the last session, Treaty of Birgham is one of the kind of tentpole events in the Scottish Wars of Independence. For the first section, it really is quite significant. It's how the Guardians legally lay out the protections that are going to maintain the ongoing independence of Scotland no matter what happens to the monarchy, and it's going to be something that's going to pop up and be referred to again in the future. So we're going to take that as a basis to use as the answer for our evaluate the usefulness question. Now, what do we remember about the Treaty of Birgham then, seeing as it's going to be the core of our answer? Now, to jog your memories, Neil in class would take us through a very handy little clip of his History of Scotland series. However, lacking Neil at the moment, we are going to rely on me. So, to remind ourselves, the Treaty of Birgham and what was involved. There were 5 main terms that we're going to look at today. Margaret, the Maid of Norway, would marry Edward's son, Edward of Carnarvon. If you remember, when Birgham was signed in 1290, the Maid of Norway is only 6. The young Prince Edward Carnarvon, is himself about the same age. However, royal weddings, if you remember, were planned way in advance when people were very small and young. It's very much the field of arranged marriages when we're looking at monarchies and the nobility in Western Europe at this time. So to set up the future of Scotland and to align it with England very closely, the future marriage was agreed when the maid was only 6. Now this would mean that Scottish independence would be safeguarded because of the terms of the treaty. If we're going to bring these two kingdoms together, the Guardians wanted to make sure that Scotland's ongoing independence would be respected and that the kingdom would not just be subsumed into the kingdom of the maid's future husband, Edward. The Treaty of Birgham also guaranteed that Scottish laws, liberties and customs, which were different from the English ones, would be preserved and maintained, and not replaced by English law. Also that no parliament governing Scotland would be held in England, so Scottish nobles will meet in Scotland with the Maid of Norway, the future queen, to decide on Scotland's fate that will not be decided by English nobles in England. Scotland's church would also maintain its separateness and independence from the Church of England, which had long had ambitions on absorbing it. And our 6th point, important positions in Scotland to be held by Scots only, and taxes raised in Scotland were to be spent on Scottish things. This means that Scottish taxes would not be spent paying for English wars abroad. Taking that as the basis of our knowledge, we're now going to apply that to our first evaluate the usefulness source question. In the higher course, if you recall, there are 4 questions that are going to pop up in the Scottish paper. We've already had a look at, in session 2, the how fully question. The evaluate usefulness question is perhaps one of the trickier ones in that there are lots of different things to remember that you need to do during the question, but we'll go through them all today. This is very similar to the type of question you'll meet in the National 5 paper, but you may notice that this one is worth 8 marks, whereas the National 5 would be worth 5. This is an example of a question that you may meet in the higher paper, and we're going to use this as an example of how to answer it. So the next section of this video is going to be about building up that specimen answer to one of these questions. So you're going to then use that as your template to have a go at answering one yourself. Now here are the rules for the source evaluation question in the higher paper. The question will always start by asking you to evaluate the usefulness of the source. If the question doesn't start with this, it is a different type of question, so please do not follow those steps in that case. The source evaluation question will be worth 8 marks. You can get 4 marks for going over provenance. Now that covers all these things here shown in italics, so if you write about the author, so basically who wrote the source. If you make comments on the date the source was written, the type of source, and what its potential purpose is, each one of these comments, if they're properly laid out, can get you a mark. There are also 2 marks available for evaluating the content. That is where you're going to quote a piece of the content and tell the reader if it's useful or not useful and relate it to the question. 3 marks are available for relevant recall as well. So this is you showing off what you have learned. So that's why we did a wee recap at the start there. So if there's anything not in the source that is relevant to the question that's attached to it that you know about, you can build that into your answer as relevant recall. Now in a specimen answer, when you approach it in an exam type question setting, my advice is always to read the question first so you understand what you're going to be doing, and then go into looking at the source. When you start your answer off, you'd always start by using the words of the question. For example, source is useful as evidence of how the Kingdom of Scotland's rights were protected in the time of the succession crisis as, and then you go on to break it down into the different elements we're going to learn about. You write your answer from the point of view as if you're a researcher producing a written report for an historian who's investigating the issue. So I guess this is the higher history course trying to build you some life skills here, guys. It is basically getting you to produce an analyst's report. So in a real life context, that might be, for instance, like a police officer coming back to a superior officer with a report of events that may have happened in a crime, or it could be a researcher feeding back to their manager, or it could be a journalist analysing a story and then feeding back to their editor. That's the kind of point of view you want to kind of put yourself on. Those of you who've come through the middle school and are maybe coming back to history in S6 may have been taught ADTPIO code. You could use that as an approach if you want, but it can also break down into the COWPAT acronym as well. We do like content, emissions, when, purpose, author, type. Whatever one you're familiar with is up to you. What I do recommend though is that you follow the format you're about to see, regardless of whatever letters you want to follow as your code. For each point you make, to get a mark, you must evaluate that point. So that's when you say it's useful or not useful. You make a point, so that could be a quote from the source, or it could be telling me about what type of source it is, or it could be telling me about the date it was made or who made it. Then you finish off your point by explaining it. So that's when you tie it in back to the question to show me how that information is relevant. So to recap, you're evaluating, so useful, not useful, making a point, so you tell me something about the source, and then you explain it. So that's how you tie it back into the question. For every mark, you need to follow those 3 steps. That's going to be very important. Best way to do that is to take a new paragraph for every point that you make. So if you can see at the top of the screen, this is an 8-mark answer. You are aiming to write 8 short paragraphs to get full marks for your answer. Normal standard kind of writing size like Jota, you're probably looking to lay down about 2 pages of ruled A4 in your answer here. In the exam, you're going to have 20 minutes to read the source and to write an answer to this question. Now, by the time you get to the exam, you obviously have learned the entire course, you've been revising for it, you've practiced how to do these questions. You will be significantly faster at doing this than you would be here in your first kind of attempt at a higher level version of one of these. So do not stress about how long this may take you to do the first time around. You will get much, much faster. So here's our example question again. Our first thing to do is to find a couple of pieces of evidence in the source that relate to the question. So if our question here is to evaluate the usefulness of source A as evidence of how the Kingdom of Scotland's rights were protected in the time of the succession crisis. If you have a wee read through that source, perhaps pause the video just now and see if you can pick out anything that is relevant to that question. Okay. First relevant point is that the rights and liberties and customs of Scotland shall be wholly preserved. Now, if you've had a chance to print this off as a PowerPoint, it might be a great idea to run a highlighter over these points so they pop out to you. The second point is that the Kingdom of Scotland should remain separate and divided from the Kingdom of England by rightful boundaries and borders. Third point is that Scotland should remain free and independent. You could also pick out that no tenant-in-chief of the King of Scotland should be forced to go outside the kingdom to do homage or fealty. And finally, that no parliament should be held out with the kingdom and borders of Scotland on matters concerning that kingdom. So here we've got 5 relevant points within the source to that question. Now the sources will always have at least 3 things for you to pick out. This one's got quite a few to be fair, but there'll always be information in there that is relevant for the question for you to find. So what do we do next? Now we're going to annotate the source. Now annotate means take notes next to something. So if you had, for instance, this printed out, you would then be using the next stage here to write some notes round about this source box. Likewise, if you're tackling this question as a homework item, normally in school, you'd have a hard copy printout of this and you'd be highlighting on the source here, you'd be taking notes round about it as well. If obviously you're just watching this through here on a video, I want you to go through with me and see what happens, and this would be your kind of normal practice for analysing a source. So we're going to be looking at the author, the date and the type next, now that we've found the relevant content inside it. Ooh, look at that, lovely transition. The first thing up is the author. Now, that line of information above your source box is called the rubric. You'll always find some useful information up there. It will tell you the author, either directly or indirectly, and it will tell you the time it was made. It'll probably also tell you the type. So there's 3 marks worth of content in that single line there for you. So in this case, we've got a bit of a tricky author. So sometimes they're really kind and they'll tell us the source was written by King Edward I, or some named personage, and we can just wheel that out. The source was written by this person, they're useful or not useful, and then you give your reasons why. This one, they've gone for a bit of a tricky one. So they told us what the source is, but they haven't told us explicitly who wrote it. In this case, because we've obviously learned about the Treaty of Birgham in our last session, we should know that the Treaty of Birgham was written by the Guardians of Scotland and King Edward I's ambassadors. So because we've got that prior learning, we can bring that to this answer. And sometimes in higher history, they'll challenge you a bit and they'll throw in sources like this and they expect you to maybe know who made them, because that's part of the learning of the course. As I said earlier on, the Treaty of Birgham is a fairly big deal in this course, so knowing all about it, who made it, the main points of it, is going to be a really useful thing for us to take away from this section of the course. So in this case, here we go. When it comes to the author, we're going to write down who made that treaty. So it was the Guardians of Scotland and Edward I's ambassadors. Now at this point in mind, we are just annotating, we're taking notes around the source, we're not writing up a full answer. Next, we're looking at the date. Why is that date significant? So it's telling us the date, but it's up for us to work out why that's useful or not. So in this case, noting it down again, we would say that the July 1290 is written while the maid is in line to inherit the throne. The Guardians are currently at this time still running Scotland, and there's some uncertainty over the succession. So at this point, we've thrashed out, I guess, obviously this is the Treaty of Birgham, so we're thrashing out what is going to happen to the future of Scotland. But at this point, until that treaty is really signed off, there's still some uncertainty about how things are going to pan out. We've got 6 Guardians running Scotland, but what's going to happen with the maid in our future years? So it's relevant, I guess, at this time, because it is definitely very much during Scotland's succession crisis, which is mentioned in the question. So the next thing up, and one of the maybe trickier things to approach when you do the evaluate the usefulness question, is looking at the type of source. Now when it says type, we are being asked to comment, well, what is it? Is it a diary entry? Is it a law? Is it someone's memoir? Is it a history book about someone? We basically need to spot for ourselves what that is. So in this case, obviously it's the Treaty of Birgham. That means it is a legal document. Any treaty signed between 2 countries is a legal document when it gets signed off and the royal seals, or the seals of the Guardians in this case, are put on it. So our type is it's treaty, it's a legal document written to set down laws. So in this case, it's going to be quite a reliable source. If it's something as important as a law, then yes, we can absolutely rely on this to be fact. Okay, so we've covered 3 things there. We've got the author, the date, the type. We've also found loads of things within the source that are relevant. So we can, if you remember, get a maximum of 2 marks for discussing source content. If we were able to build the 2 points in source content and the 3 annotated points we've made above the source box into a proper structured answer, we'd be now looking at 5 marks out of 8. Which would be kind of, to get 5 out of 8 would be on the cusp between a B and an A, I guess. So we'd be doing really well so far already. Let's see what else we need to do to get full marks in our answer. So what we do now, we need to annotate the source for this purpose. So the purpose. Now, I would say, as someone who's taught how useful questions or evaluate usefulness questions as they are now, for a number of years, purpose is usually the thing that trips up candidates when they're trying to answer these questions. If you note as well, when we get 4 marks for provenance for, as you can see, the things along the top, type, author, date, purpose, if you add that to the 2 for your source content, it makes 6. And there are 3 marks available for source recall if you know enough stuff. That's 9. So that's 1 more than the maximum marks available for this question. That means you don't need to do all of the things. So if you do know enough in recall to make it up to the 8, purpose is the one I would probably leave out if I were you, because it is the one most students will trip up on and not get the mark for. But for the purposes of writing an example, I think it's a fair shout that we have a go at doing it. So, purpose in this case, the Treaty of Birgham was written to put legal protection in place to safeguard the customs, laws and independence of Scotland. So, in other words, basically this is a law to protect Scotland's independence. So that's the purpose of this source. And then we're going to look at how we're going to link that into the question when we structure our answer. At this point, remember, we are just annotating, we're just taking notes about the source and what's going on. So now we are going to use our analysis source to make our evaluation of its usefulness and to start writing up our specimen answer. So this is the point where, once again, if you have been able to print off your PowerPoint and you do have access to highlighters or any kind of colours, this is a great chance for you to highlight the answers as they come up, so you can visually see how the paragraphs are broken down and how the marks kind of come about. Go through this with me, and you're going to use this as your basis of having a crack at one of these yourself. So I've got a key down the bottom. The first point is going to be your evaluation, where you say if the source is useful or not useful. The kind of brownie coloured highlighted bit is your point, so it's going to be you either pulling out some quoted information from the source that's relevant, or it's going to be making a point about author, the date, the purpose, you name it, as we kind of go through. And then the purple bit, the last bit, is where you need to link it back to the question. You need to explain the relevance of the point that you're making. Now, in order to get a mark for each one of your paragraphs, you must address these 3 colour-coded areas. If you don't do all 3, you will not get the mark and you are wasting your time. Now remember, we're operating at a higher level here, so what we're expected to put down is going to be above and beyond what you've come across in National 5 so far, if you have indeed come through that route. So for our specimen answer then, let's go through our first paragraph. Source A is useful, so that's us making our evaluation, as evidence of how the Kingdom of Scotland's rights were protected in the time of the succession crisis. Now I have just pretty much gone verbatim and copied the question into my opening line there, and that's good practice for you guys to do too. So I've made a judgment, I have mentioned the question, and here's my point. It was written by the Guardians of Scotland and the Ambassadors of King Edward I. So I'm covering author here. Now I need to explain. So after the death of Alexander III, the Guardians were responsible for running Scotland. A document produced by them, which was designed to put legal safeguards in place to protect the kingdom, will therefore be useful, as they were in charge of Scotland this time and the responsibility for protecting it lay with them. Okay, that would get you your first mark. So it's for origin or provenance, and it will come up for author. So you've made an evaluation, the bit in red, you've made your point, a bit in brown, lovely choice of colour there by me, and then you have made your explanation in purple, so you've explained why your point's relevant to that question. Okay, as a kind of guide as well, this length of paragraph is about what we're looking to do for each one of the paragraphs hereafter. So the second mark comes from date. So it says the source is useful, this is my evaluation, as it was written in July of 1290 at a time when the Maid of Norway was in line to succeed the throne, but as yet too young to rule herself. So I've made my point. I've taken that information from the rubric, that line that was above the source, added in a wee bit of kind of insight and analysis for myself, and then I'm going to explain in purple. So this is during a time of uncertainty over who would inherit as Scotland's ruler, and therefore is useful for learning about how the kingdom was protected during the succession crisis. Alright, it's not quite as in-depth as that first paragraph, but nevertheless it makes the evaluation, it gives a relevant point to the question, and then there's an effort made to explain the relevance of the date in this case and to tie it back into the question. Once again, you see how the colour coding works, hopefully you've got a chance to print this off and colour code it yourself. So we're now on 2 marks out of 8. Next up is going to be the type of the source. So source A is useful, is my evaluation again, is evidence about how the Kingdom of Scotland was protected during the succession crisis, so I've kind of linked into the question again, as it is part of the Treaty of Birgham, a legal agreement between the rulers of England and Scotland. So I've made my point, I've written clearly what type of source this is a legal document. Now I've got to explain. So in purple it says, this is useful as it shows us the methods used by the Guardians to try and protect their kingdom's independence in 1290. So I'm explaining the importance of trying to use basically laws to protect the kingdom during the succession crisis. Okay, so we've covered author, we've covered date, we've covered the type. The next thing up is going to be the tricky one, purpose. So the source is also useful, making my evaluation again there in red, as, and here's my point, it was written to put legal protection in place to safeguard the customs, laws and independence of Scotland. Now, if you can remember back a couple of slides, that is almost word for word taken from the note I put next to the source when I was jotting down and annotating my ideas around the source of how to analyse a thing. So I've just lifted that from my notes and I'm building it into this paragraph. So I need to explain that now and how it's relevant to the question. So in purple, this is useful as it is evidence of the measures taken to protect Scotland's ongoing independence during the succession crisis. Yes, there you go. So I'm now on 4 out of 8. So having done all the kind of origin and provenance section of my answer, I'm now going to look at the contents, the actual information from the source. So this is where we start to get quite different from what's done in National 5. So let's have a look. Source A is useful, so make your evaluation again. And as a point, by the way, you need to make that evaluation with every single point you make. I know it seems quite tiresome, but those are the rules, guys. If you don't make that evaluation, you don't get that mark. So you must say it's useful or not useful every time you write a paragraph here. Okay, so source A is useful as evidence about how the Kingdom of Scotland was protected during the succession crisis. Once again, I've name dropped the kind of question to make it clear what I'm talking about. As it says, and I've quoted, and it's always good practice to quote, guys, okay? It says, the rights and liberties and customs of Scotland shall be wholly preserved. Right, now having given my quote, I now need to explain how that's relevant to the question. This is where we vary quite significantly from National 5. In National 5, it was okay to write down as an explanation, this is accurate and relevant to my knowledge. That will not cut it at higher level. You will not get a mark for that. So please do not do that. You must explain your point. This is part of the difference between the levels. This is what the exam board want to see you being able to do. So you're moving beyond saying, yeah, it's right because I learned this in class, to actually showing that you understand it and explaining yourself. So in purple, let's explain how that quote is relevant to the question. So this shows the Guardians aim to protect and maintain Scotland's laws and keep them separate from England's in the event of the maid marrying Prince Edward of Carnarvon. For example, this meant that those committing crimes in Scotland would be tried under Scots law only. Okay, so hopefully you can see from that I'm explaining the significance of the quote. Now, sometimes in this section of answer, you are almost being expected by the SQA to make that kind of jump and show that you understand the context of the question, you understand this area of the course and what's going on. So you're using a little bit of kind of common sense, I guess, for yourself to extrapolate what's going on and what is the real meaning of what they are talking about in the source. That will come from the PowerPoints and the lessons and the videos that we're going through as we learn about this course. If sometimes that's not clear, then obviously having some discussion with the teacher about that is a really good idea to help you broaden your understanding of what's going on and what the key important events and ideas and themes are of the course. So the next mark is going to be based on content too. So it says the source is also useful, so making a judgment again is my evaluation. As it says, and here's my quote, the Kingdom of Scotland shall remain separate and divided from the Kingdom of England by rightful boundaries and borders. Good, so I made my point, now I need to explain it. This is important as it shows that the Guardians sought to protect Scotland by maintaining stability and preserving the border between England and Scotland, which Alexander III had managed to settle during his reign. So with that explanation, I'm just bringing in a bit of what I've learned so far in the course to show the importance of maintaining that border. It is important that the Guardians have spotted they don't want Scotland to be subsumed into England and just be sucked into this broader kingdom. So one of the key points to make sure that doesn't happen is to make sure the border is nailed down in law and it can't just be ignored or that it just evaporates away as the kingdoms merge. So it's an important point to make, and that's what I'm spelling out in the purple section there. So I've got my maximum 2 marks for content. If I was to go on and talk about any other things that we had highlighted from the source, I couldn't get any extra marks for them because the maximum I can get is 2 for content in the higher level evaluate the usefulness question. So I need to look for the last area where I can get marks, and that's going to be on omissions or recall. Things are not included in the source that I have learned in my prior learning. So start off again by making an evaluation. Source A is less useful, and when you're doing your omissions, the source is always less useful because it's missed something out. So source is less useful as evidence of how the Kingdom of Scotland was protected during the succession crisis, as it fails to tell us that it was agreed the Church of Scotland was to remain free of interference or control by the Church of England. Now, you'll notice this is a wee bit different from the previous paragraphs. My point here is basically that something is being missed out, and when I'm doing my recall section, that's kind of my basic premise for each one of these paragraphs is something has been missed. My explanation is the fact that I want to bring in. So you've got to make your evaluation. It's less useful. Your point is something has been missed out from the broader story here, and then your explanation is what that information is that you have learned from your wider learning in the course so far. And then my final mark is going to come from another point of omission. The source is less useful, there's evaluation again, as it fails to tell us, there's my point, that it was agreed that taxes raised in Scotland were only to be spent in Scotland to pay for Scottish needs. And there we go. Now it's okay for you to expand upon the purple section there. I've given a fact. I might want to go and expand on that a wee bit and explain the relevance of that. That's okay, and that's probably good practice too, but also bear in mind how much time you have to work on this answer. To read the source, find the relevant information, think about how to start off in your answer and actually write the thing out. You've got 20 minutes in the exam and that's it. So usually candidates will, by the time they get to the exam, be working to about that speed, maybe with a kind of minute or two to spare, depending on how accessible the source is. At this stage, remember though, you are just learning the ropes still, so it's okay to take longer. So now it's our turn. We're going to attempt the next evaluate the usefulness question shown on the following slide. You're going to use the notes you took from our lesson on the treaties of Salisbury and Birgham in the last session, along with the mind map at the start of this session to provide the recall for your answer. You're going to attempt your answer following the pattern we've established in this session through the specimen answer. So you're looking to do your 8 short paragraphs. You may want to colour code it in your answer, that would be great if you do, but please make sure you have those 3 steps in your paragraphs of your own answer. So remember, you're always going to be making an evaluation, you always need a point, and you always need to explain your point and tie it back to the question. So I'd like you guys to complete your answer and submit it for our next session, and as a tip, the next source is written by a historian. Now when they appear as sources, you can always consider them to be useful, as the SQA will always give us historians who are experts and who are writing with the benefit of hindsight. These guys have looked across the whole of this topic area, drawing on all the sources available. On top of that, they've got loads of historiography or other historians' work that they're able to read and bring in their insights too, so they have a very much a broad picture to draw upon to work out the relevance of the source that we've been given. So the sources from specialist history books are always written without bias. They are written to inform their audience. Okay guys, so bear those points in mind whenever you tackle a source written by a historian, as in the case of this one. So here we go guys, this is your source to have a crack at, your first higher level evaluate the usefulness question for yourself. Please follow the structure that's been shown in this session and have a go at writing out your own 8 paragraphs. Now how you split them up is up to you. You might want to do 4 on origins, that would be author, timing, type and purpose. You could do 2 on content and 2 on omission, or you may wish to ditch one of those 4 origin points and put in 3 points for omission instead. The video here gives you a full guide on how to approach one of these. If you have any questions, please get in touch, I'll be happy to help. Well, that's it for this time guys, thanks very much.